Jesus said in John chapter 12, "And I, if I be lifted up from the earth, will draw all men unto me." That's what Jesus said. And that's what we're trying to do here at Emmanuel. Hello, my name's Pastor Bob Gray, and I'm glad that you've taken the time to join us for one of our services. Our goal here at Emmanuel is to lift up Christ, to lift him up so high that no matter where you're at right now, he will draw you closer to him. That's our goal. May you enjoy the services of Emmanuel. And if I can be of service to you, please let me know. God bless you. Enjoy the service. In 1 Chronicles chapter 20, let's pick up in verse number 1. 1 Chronicles chapter 20 and verse number 1. "And it came to pass that after the year was expired, at the times that kings go out to battle, Joab led forth the power of the army and wasted the country of the children of Ammon, and came and besieged Rabbah. But David tarried at Jerusalem, and Joab smote Rabbah and destroyed it." 1 Chronicles chapter 20, verse 2. "And David took the crown of their king from off his head, and found it to weigh a talent of gold, and there was precious stones in it. And it was set upon David's head, and he brought also exceeding much spoil out of the city. And he brought out the people that were in it, and cut them with saws and harrows of iron and axes with axes. Even so dealt David with all the cities of the children of Ammon. And David and all the people returned to Jerusalem." I'm going to preach this morning on this subject, the story without the details. The story without the details. I'm going to kind of go into a classroom setting, and if you could give me your undivided attention and kind of go with me through what some would consider mundane, boring biblical details. The Bible you hold in your hand, or the Bible that sits in your lap, is a library of 66 books. It is divided into two sections, the Old Testament and the New Testament. The Old Testament, New Testament, 400 years of darkness between the two testaments right there. The Old Testament, of course, is divided out in between sections in and of themselves. And now you have all of a sudden these 40 different human authors spread out over generations that they're always referencing points of history. This is what makes this a God book. It is a book that, although the human is the pen, and don't never forget this, our Bible is not by mind of man, but it's by the heart of God. God used man as the pen of a ready writer. So anytime you find a reference, do not think that man was smart enough to think this one up. God was divine enough to give us his footprint as he walks through the scripture. So this is what this book is all about. 1st, 2nd Chronicles. Preceding that, you have 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. You're going to find out that the Chronicles, these two books, are very much an abridged account. Or for those of us from the 80s, it is the Cliff Notes that exist to kind of give us the overview of Jewish history. These books were written during a very interesting time. These times is the Babylonian captivity. God's people were carried away into Babylonian captivity, and here they were, divorced from their homeland, divorced from anything that resembled Jewish history. These writers, these multiplicity of writers in the Chronicles, these people that took this history, but what they did is they made sure that they understood, or the Jewish people understood the importance, that although you're in that captivity, please don't lose your identity. This morning I want to tell you, and if you were here in this auditorium, I would tell you the same thing. The hardest thing you and I will ever do as we march forward from where God started us is not to lose our identity as we march through to the future. There is this push on today. Get out of my way. There is this push on today that we don't want our identity. We don't want the stains of the past. Let me tell you, that it was very important to these writers that when they got in there, that they understood that you need to be very familiar with your heritage. And that this heritage in captivity, these chronicles were to show this. They wanted to tie the kings to the blessings of God. This is amazing. That every time a king embraced the spiritual, God brought the blessings. Every time a king would humble his throne to be subject or submissive to the will of God, God brought the blessings. But every time a king decided not to be what God wanted him to be, then God not only withheld the blessings, but he brought captivity. And God has this unique way of putting us in an armhold and putting us in a position that if we are not going to honor him, then guess what he always does? He always takes us into captivity, not for the sake of punishment or demise, but for the sake of bringing us to a point to where we lift our eyes and say, God, we need you. This was what was going on. The Jews are in captivity. The Jews are in Babylonian rule. And the writers here, as you will see later on past the poetry books, you're going to find out that they wanted to give a chronicle. This is why you find papers named chronicle. The reason is because this is the newspaper. This is the writing that is going to be handed to a discouraged people, to a people that were already in bondage, to a people that were already in captivity. They were already going through a very, very tough time. And as they're going through a tough time, it was very important that they were handed the chronicles. They were handed the newspaper. They were handed these cliff notes. And what they were trying to do was tell them this: hey, you come from a land that carries a great big God. You are part of a family, a heritage, that there's a great big God back there. And don't become more like the Babylonians. Retain your national pride. Retain your identity. Always remember who you are, where you come from, where you're going, and that the nation you're living in captivity with is not the nation that will end up winning. The nation you're living in captivity with is only a tool by God. And these chronicles was very, very important. The purpose, again, was to reach back into history, pull and extract the events and minus the evil, so that they could hand to a future generation a national pride without a burdensome blight. This has always been the tightrope that everybody walks. It's easy, if you have never had hurt in your past, to be joyous and optimistic about the future. But the spiritual Christians, and this is where I'm going to ask you to go to today, the spiritual Christians, the mature Christians, write the chronicles for their present times. I am 53 years of age. I have not lived any length of time like most of the people I pastor. But I have lived long enough to know this: there must be in me a mind and a heart that I chronicle our events of our history, that I chronicle its victories, I chronicle its failures, I chronicle to give to the present generation a national pride about who we are, what we've always been, without the gory, depraved details. If you will look at 1 Chronicles chapter 20. When I read this text several weeks ago, I got pulled into the text, and then I started tearing apart 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings, because there was a phrase used here that I was like, that they didn't even tell the truth. But my first thought was, as I reverted to a liberal, humanistic, Fox News, CNN,
mentality. And I was reading this, and it came to pass, verse 1, that after the year was expired, at the times the kings go out to battle. Now, I know enough about the book and have preached enough in this book that I'm getting ready, and I know what the time frame is, I know what the time period is, and I'm like, oh, here we go again. Go out to battle. Joab led forth the power of the army and wasted the country of the children of Ammon and came and besieged Rabbah. But David tarried at Jerusalem. Ladies and gentlemen, that's a very famous phrase. But look at it, and Joab smote Rabbah and destroyed it, and David took the crown. All of a sudden it was like, whoa, time out. Time out. How come you didn't go into the story? And there was a part of me that I was like, hey, they didn't even tell the truth. Isn't that sad? Isn't that sad that even as a preacher of the gospel, that my heart and my mind ran to the depraved details? But then you must understand, they are in a very Babylonish time. This is already tough enough. How do you get them to keep this who are we, and this identity? And then the writers realized this one fact. Are you ready? You have to bolster pride in who we are. Not being proud, but pride in who we are. And the only way you get it done in this generation is to tell them about this past generation, but minus the details. You know, if you'll go to 2 Samuel chapter 11 in verse number 1, this is the happenings. This is why it's in the text, because this is real facts right here. 2 Samuel chapter 11 verse 1, this is the time frame that is chronicled. 2 Samuel chapter 11 verse 1. I want you to look at it. 2 Samuel chapter 11 verse 1. And it came to pass, after the year was expired, at the time when kings go forth to battle, David sent Joab and his servant with him and all Israel. And they destroyed the children of Ammon and besieged Rabbah. But David tarried still at Jerusalem. This is the link. Look at the link. Where Chronicles never referenced what happened when he tarried at Jerusalem. The facts, the police report, the incident report that God puts down in 2 Samuel chapter 11 is never brought up in the newspaper of 1 Chronicles. The details of the accident that happened, the awfulness that happened right here in verse number 2. Look at it. And it came to pass in an eventide that David arose from off his bed and walked upon the roof of the king's house. And from the roof he saw a woman washing herself, and the woman was very beautiful to look upon. You keep reading. This is the accident. This was the intersection of a lazy king and a lustful heart, a woman taken aback. This is the intersection. This is the tragedy. And from this tragedy, it just got worse. But in the newspaper that the Jews had in Babylon, it was never referenced. It just simply said, hey, part of your history is that David tarried in Jerusalem. Then Joab went and took Rabbah. They got this crown, and they put it on. Do you know what they were trying to hand? You know what they were trying to hand to these Jews? They were trying to hand to these Jews victory. Victory! We conquer. This is who we are. And they left out the personal, this is very important, the personal failure of leaders. The thing that occupied my time was because I went back and traced 1st and 2nd Chronicles, the newspaper, and 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings, and I wanted to see what didn't they put in the newspaper. What was it that they reported, Chronicles? What was it that they reported about the history that they left out? There were just a few things. They left out David's adulterous affair with Bathsheba. They left out the consequence of this affair. They left out the fact that the firstborn died. They left out the fact that Amnon and Tamar, brother and sister, had a sensual relationship. They left out the fact that Absalom rebelled. They mentioned nothing about the kingdom being divided, and I could go on and on and on. I was telling some of the college ladies today and men while we were sitting out there and just waiting, I was like, when I read this Bible right here, I just don't want to read it for the sake of getting through it. I want to read it because I want God to change me in my everyday living, my everyday footprints. And you know what I learned today? I learned that I have a responsibility to hand a newspaper to this generation and leave out the personal failures of leaders from time gone by. There ought to be, every day we live, I'm glad I'm saved. I'm glad I'm a Baptist. I'm glad I'm in this kind of church. I'm glad I'm raising my kids. I'm glad my grandchildren can be part of this, because I don't want to go anyplace else. I don't want to live any other way. I love my heritage. And in a day and time when people are trying to whitewash and they're trying to distance themselves and drop Baptist from the name, and they've done declaring themselves, I want to step up and say this: we got a pretty good heritage, and our grandfathers and forefathers did a great job to get us to this point of Babylon living without losing our Baptist heritage. And that was the Chronicles. That was the Chronicles. The hardest thing you will ever do listening to me is this: is to be the recipient of personal failure by spiritual leaders and write a newspaper and not include it. The hardest thing you'll ever do is pick up the newspaper and read this. Let me tell you about our history. There was a day when David tarried. Kings go forth to war, but David tarried, and David stayed behind. And then Joab won the battle. And Joab brought home the crown to where these people. And what we've done is we've taken this generation and the hurt from spiritual leaders from this generation is now hurting our children. Instead of God becoming bigger in their life, they look at the system as a failure. Listen to this. There is no system with God. He's God. He uses humans to get done what he needs to get done. And right now, everybody listening to me, that you're in your 30s, your 40s, and your 50s, every one of you, let me ask you a question. How are you writing your newspaper? When you sit down at your editorial desk and you write your op-ed, how are you writing our history to give? When you look through the Bible, it is very difficult. It is very difficult for you and I to take people we love that have given us moral failures. What do you do with those things? I wrote down a statement in my quiet time. The truth of everything that I've just preached is this: it's time to let the failures of man die in the forgiveness of God. I want to say that again. It is time to let the failures of man die in the forgiveness of God. Doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you and I think this person should have not. Doesn't matter. We have to live. Our job is to pass along the good minus the bad. And I think the only reason that people still bring up failure, everybody listen to me, the only reason people still bring up failure is because they have not washed it in forgiveness. Because anybody can be a victim. Anybody can scream and holler and be mad. But it takes a mature person to forgive and then pass that along. I'm going to ask you and I today to put it in proper perspective. You say, Pastor, how do you do that? How do you do that? How do you do it? And right now, people running through their head are like, oh, no, but you don't understand this circumstance. No, you don't understand this circumstance. And this cannot be whitewashed. This is a fact. A fact like David and Bathsheba, that kind of fact. You mean a fact like Amnon and Tamar? You mean that kind of fact? You mean a fact like Absalom? That kind of fact? You mean a fact like Absalom going to the rooftop and in the presence of, that kind of, you mean the fact like Ahithophel? You mean those kind of facts? Let me show you what God does with facts. Go to Numbers chapter 14, if you will. Well, let's go to Exodus 34 in verse number 7 first, because it's a constant theme when we're trying to learn the heart of God. And by the way, that's the only heart that matters, the heart of God. That is the only one. Exodus chapter 34 and verse number 7. Look what he says. Keeping mercy for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgressions and sins. Now, I want you to notice this. Look what the word says. Exodus 34 and verse number 7. Keeping mercy for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgressions and sin. And that will by no means clear the what? Guilty. Now that's very important. You know what our God says? Keep the word open because we're going to continue the verse. But let me just interject here. Do you know what God is saying? God is saying, David, Bathsheba, David and Uriah. He said, here's who I am. I'm going to keep mercy for thousands. I'm going to forgive iniquity and transgressions and sin. That covers everything from accidentally, if you will, because of flesh, to a planned murder with Uriah. I'm going to take care of it all. But it doesn't come off your record. It's a fact. And this fact of the fact that you are an adulterer and that you are a murderer, it's just a fact. But I don't hold against you, David, that fact. You see, most people think that if I forgive somebody, and maybe this is helping some of y'all this morning to understand, it's time to start a new chronicle about the facts. Because if you pass on the failures of the facts, those failures impacted you, but that failure 20 years ago by a leader that your children don't even know, what bearing does that have? What bearing does that have? Well, they're independent Baptists, and they're part of that movement. Let me tell you something. Like a car movement, like if you ever had a bad dealer, salesman, I'm not giving a free pass at all. I think that the guilty need to go to jail. I think the guilty need to be fired from their pulpits. I think the guilty need to resign from the ministry. I'm not giving a free pass on that. But let me tell you something. Once the guilty have been dealt with, it's time to move on. And it's time to give a chronicle of a great big God and let it die. But look what he said here. In visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children and upon the children's children to the third and to the fourth generation. How did he visit the father's iniquity? Because when it says visit, it means I'm showing up. So how did he visit the iniquity? You know what he visited it with? He visited it with two things: forgiveness and reality. Do you know what? What David did has impacted us. And maybe what your fathers and your grandfathers and your spiritual leaders from times past, maybe what they did impacted you, and now it's going to But when your children and your children's children hear about this, you know what God's going to do? God will show up with the same mercy and the same forgiveness and the same reality. It's just a fact. Go to Numbers chapter 14 and verse 18. We find this again. We find it again. I didn't have such a deep appreciation for the Chronicles until I started studying this. Numbers chapter 14, verse 18. The Lord is long-suffering and of great mercy, forgiving iniquity and transgression, by no means clearing the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children unto the third and fourth generation. My sermon this morning is very, very simple. Everybody's a newspaper editor. Everybody that's listening to me, you're writing a front page. You're writing it. And the children. I'm going to tell you a story and I'm going to end. It's a very delicate story. When I was 15 years of age, 14 years of age, I was attending a youth rally in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Our church picked up when we went. My youth director, Brother Kip, took us over there, and it was packed. It was packed. Ironically, the funny thing about it is I have some pastor friends that were all the same age that unbeknownst to us, I think there's 3 or 4 of us, unbeknownst to us, we were all at that youth rally at the same time. There was a youth speaker there that after he got done speaking, it totally transformed our lives, like totally transformed us. We walked up and, hey, would you sign our Bible? And by the way, whoever started that needs to be hung from the highest hill. Okay? I'm just telling you that. I'm thinking about carrying a stamp around. There you go. And so the youth speaker was there, and so we all gathered around. We got our picture taken. Well, I did. I should say we. Each of us later, we realized all of us did. Now, the pictures back then were little Kodak cameras with the light bulb on top that, and it's flipped, you know. Y'all have no idea what I'm talking about. How many right there know what I'm talking about? How many people in this auditorium know what you took the film and you went and got it, and then you had to wait. Am I right? Can I get a witness on that one? And you didn't have time because whatever you were when they clicked it, that's how you were for the rest of your life. So if you were like, then that's how you were the rest of your life. And so a couple of weeks went by, and they call it snail mail now. A letter arrived at the house, and this letter arrived at the house, and it was from this youth speaker. And I was like, wow, I got a letter. So I took that letter and I framed it. I mean, this is how much of a groupie I was, if that's what you want to call it, a fan, a stalker. And so I took it, and I can remember that I put it in a frame, and we were living on Delbrook at the time, behind the Catholic church that's out there now off of Pine Tree Road. And so I had the in room, and so I had it in a frame, and that picture I had in the bottom of the frame, the letter was, I read it, and it said this: Dear Bobby, to some of these elements. It was very nice to meet you. You come from a very rich family. Your dad is a wonderful pastor. Always love God. Always stay in your word. And The letter sitting up there. Well, we have this saying in the Gray family that whenever something odd happens, we go, Murphy did it. It's called Murphy's Law. I don't know if y'all have the same thing in your house. I think it really is called demons or sisters, one of the two. But if something's out of the ordinary in the house, like something's flipped over, then it was like, man, Murphy's Law. Murphy's, that was our ghost, okay? We had the Holy Ghost that indwelt us, and then the Murphy ghost that plagued us. So it was standing up on my dresser, and I would come in, and it would be face down. And I would stand it back up. I'd go to school and come back, and it's face down. And I'm like, I stood it up, and it was like, came back, face down. Now I'm ticked. And so I can remember walking out to the family and going, hey, was ever in my room, stay out of my room. Because stop knocking over my letter. My mother, whoa, there are very few things that you look at, can I? Okay, it wasn't as cool as the first time. It's called the Bible flip. And so my mother kept putting it down. And then she said this to me. She said, Bobby, let me tell you something. Keep your eyes on Jesus. And I'm glad that there are people who have inspired you about Jesus. But you know, probably what would be better is for you to put a Bible verse in that frame and get God's words rather than man's words. Made sense to me. So I can remember going in there going, oh yeah, because this preacher definitely would want me having Jesus' words instead of his. So I remember taking the letter out. I folded it up. In fact, I still have it in my office. I folded it up. I put it in a box. And I can remember sitting down and writing out a couple of verses. I put it in the frame. And from that point, years go by. And I'm now 19 and a half. I'm married. Don't get any ideas. I'm 19 and a half and I'm married. And then it was like, I can remember 2021. This is now 89, 90. A couple of things happened during those years. Then I went back to my mom and I said, hey, Mom, now it's time to fess up, okay? Do you remember the letter that you kept by this youth speaker? Did you know the entire time that this was the most immoral youth speaker of ever? And listen to what my mom told me. She said, I knew it, but why should I throw his depravity into your love for God? You know what my mama did? My mama wrote me a newspaper. She handed me the best gift ever. And that was my God's big. And then my mama said these words. Bob, never forget, if God can use a donkey to speak his word, then that's why he uses man. Because sometimes they're a donkey. My mom didn't play. She just called it like it was. The best thing I ever do for people around me is to hand them facts and knowing the details and letting it die with me. Die with me. Buried with me. Die with me. Buried with me. Does that sound like anybody else? Does that sound like anybody else that went to a cross and died on an old rugged cross and took your sins and my sins and buried them? And he rose up living the resurrected life. Baptism doesn't save anybody, but what a great representation of the fact that Jesus died for us. He was buried. And the ugliness of what he was when he went into the tomb was not the beauty of who he was when he came out of the grave. It's very simple today. If you're writing your newspaper, write the story without the details. cynicism needs to be gone. A smirkiness on the face needs to be gone. People need to be referenced without somebody saying, well, do you know the truth? Let it die. God is the final judge. Because my grandkids right now have no concept of who the spiritual leaders were in my life, except they're a name. That's it. That's it.